it is the thing that can grow the people most. And it's also the thing that can also help the church in terms of like generosity.
Right.
You know, and it's like when you get that, it's just so freeing because you never feel like you're trying to get something from people. Like when you truly believe, no, this is best for them. Like when you really, really deeply believe this is best for them, like it frees you up, I think, to talk about money and generosity in a way that's not weird. Because some pastors talk about it, but everybody can feel that they feel weird about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, dude, if if you're the slick salesman, I mean, people know that.
Right.
But that's because that's what you are.
Right.
You either are or you ain't. And it's like, if you are the slick salesman that's trying to talk about their discipleship, but really it's about the fact that you just really want the church to have a lot more money so y'all can do whatever, people are going to feel that, But if we talk about money in a way that, like, no, two things are true. Number one, this is about our heart collectively. And God's going to take us to some places that he's not going to take us any other way. Number two, man, when he does that, the overflow is going to be money, and we're going to see ministry go gangbusters. We're going to see adoptions. We're going to see missionaries sent. We're going to see new campuses launched. We're going to plant churches. Mm-hmm. But it's both of those things. And one of them actually is primary. The discipleship component is primary. I think that one of the ways, Bob, I know that we're trying to strive on this podcast to try to get people to maybe, this is one of those matrix moments where people are like, if a pastor has ever said out loud, man, I really just don't like to talk about money with our people, or I try not to do that or something. I mean, there's probably something there they need to drill down on. That's like, well, are you thinking about it the right way?
Right.
Because if you really believed it is one of the primary ways that you disciple someone, how would you say out loud, I really struggle to talk about that,
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Breaking Barriers podcast. I'm Pastor Bobby here with Pastor Andrew, and very excited about today's topic. We're going to be talking about generosity and the role of generosity in discipleship, the role of money in discipleship, and this is such an important thing in the life of a church leader, in the life of a pastor. I know for our conference this upcoming fall, one of the things that's got us really thinking about this is we're doing sort of a pre-conference, half a day before the conference, where we're going to be talking about just the role of fundraising, the role of generosity, fueling your vision, how generosity fuels the vision, how it's such an important part of discipleship. So we also figured we would go ahead and record some podcasts around these topics. So we've just been kind of thinking about this. So I'll sort of intro it, and then I'll turn it over to Pastor Andrew. So I think today's topic is like the game changer when it comes to the way to think about money and finances in the life of the church and like the life of the pastor, like his role in raising money. Because here's how a lot of times we think about it. We think, okay, after somebody becomes a Christian, it's almost like we're trying to get them to do a bunch of like this, the smaller, more likely things that we can get them to do. It's like, okay, they're coming to church and maybe we can get them to serve, like maybe we can get them to hold a door or something like that. Maybe one day, they'll go a little bit deeper and maybe they'll get into a community group that's maybe going to require more risk in their life, getting in relationships with people, and, maybe they'll go on a mission trip one day. That's kind of a further step down the road. And a lot of times the way we think about it is like one of the very last things that we expect people to do in their discipleship is to actually start giving, right? And even in that, it's like, okay, at first, maybe it's just like we expect them to, give a little bit when the offering bucket goes around. And then, maybe one day they'll give consistently and they're still not tithing. And then maybe one day, like way down the road, like 5 years after becoming a believer, they may actually start to tithe and give. And that's how we like think about the discipleship journey. And today you're going to kind of flip like, hey, maybe we ought to be thinking about it sort of the opposite way. And then the other thing I would say about this whole thing in terms of this being a game changer, I think in the life of the pastor, a lot of times people have, and we already filmed a podcast about pastors having hangups talking about money. One of the hangups is pastors feel like they're trying to, when they talk about money, they feel like they're trying to get something from somebody, and they don't feel like it's, something they're like doing for them, that they feel kind of sleazy. Man, I don't want to talk about money. I feel like I'm trying to like get this from people. And I think this principle today, the way the New Testament views this stuff, really kind of flips that. And I think it frees the pastor to just be super free around this.
Yeah, I mean, the short of it is, if a pastor's like, man, I don't really like talking about money because it makes me feel like I'm trying to get something from them, they might be trying to get something from them. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like they may not be thinking about it the right way.
Right.
It's like, hey, your reluctance to talk about it is actually justified because that's what you're thinking about. You're looking at a person in the congregation as a cog to fund, the what you have going on, like in your kind of wheel, so to speak. And I think we believe that is fundamentally the wrong way to think about it. Mm-hmm. We believe that in the economy of God's kingdom, what he has set up to take the mission the farthest also is supposed to take the disciple the deepest. Mm-hmm. I mean, why did Jesus talk about money more than any other spiritual matter? And it is a spiritual matter. Ben Lappin, in his book, Thou Shalt Prosper, he talks about how the idea of exchanging money and commerce is one of the things that differentiates us from the animal kingdom. I mean, it is part of the image of God that there's almost a spiritual component to the exchange of money and giving and things like that. It's very deep. I mean, we see this in Mark chapter 6. One of the go-to places that we talk about a lot. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But when you start thinking about generosity and how it plays a role, what we're arguing for on the front end of discipleship, not the product on the back end, a lot of people look at it and they think, well, I think generosity is the product of maturity. No, it's the pathway to maturity. It is a product also, but it certainly is a pathway, one of the fastest ways to get there. And Jesus demonstrates that in Mark chapter 10, in verse 21, where the Bible says that Jesus looks at the rich young ruler and says, "Go and sell all you possess and give to the poor. You'll have treasure in heaven and follow me." And then verse 22 says, "But he was deeply dismayed. He went away grieving, for he owned much property." It's just kind of plain as day. On the very front end of the discipleship journey, what must I do? What must I do to be saved? What must I do to kind of be a follower? Well, Jesus kind of looks right through all of the stuff that this guy would be able to recite, and I know the Bible, and I'm a good works, and I've done all these things from my youth and all of that. He goes right to the heart, and he says, you got to be able to be generous. And it's the one thing that the guy can't do, because it gets such at the heart of who is the owner of our life, Who is the one that sits at the very top of who calls the shots in our life? Our money really gets at that place very fast. And so I think what we would say is like, man, the first question I think people need to wrestle with is, when you're thinking about generosity culture, is the primary reason you're doing it to raise X amount of money for X amount of vision? Not a bad reason. Right. I mean, that's part of the reason, obviously, Right. But is the primary reason actually the discipleship of the believers in your church, that they would grow in their maturity? And that's why we're coming to the church and saying, hey, here's this initiative. Here's what we're doing. Man, we're asking everybody to open their hands and to give.
Yeah, I think the problem is with that, because we have like a wrong assumption, the way that I introed it is like, hey, or what you said, like generosity is like a way down the road fruit of maturity.
Right.
And so if we think of it like that, the problem is, and we've seen this a million times, you have a guy that plants a church and they think, okay, generosity is for like the very mature Christian, and for the newer believers, the people that are not believers at all, I don't want to talk about it at all, because like it's this way down the road spiritual maturity thing. When in fact, like what you're saying is, and it's really hard, I think, to get our minds around this, even though it's a very simple concept. What you're saying is Jesus used it in the ministry. Like, no, the people who are not believers, or the people that are the least mature, by talking about generosity, you skip that whole 5-year process of like, at the very end of this, they're going to be generous, and you go right after it from the very, very beginning.
Right.
Because you and I both have just so many people we know where they planted a church. They did exactly what I'm talking about. They didn't talk about it at all. And then they realized 5 years in, oh man, I made a big mistake.
Right.
Not talking about it for the last 5 years.
Right.
Not only because they did not have the funds they need to fuel the vision, but it is an extremely important part of somebody's discipleship.
Yeah, I mean, for the ministry, and we've talked about this in other venues, but like for the ministry, most of the time, the ministry is going to go about as far as the generosity of the church takes it. At Mercy Hill, we say, and we've ripped this straight off Church of the Highlands, we say a lot of times, guys, the elders set the vision, the congregation sets the pace by their generosity. There's an element to it where, yes, there is practical, God uses money to fuel ministry, right? Like, got it. That's great. That's good. We don't need to hide that. But I think what's ironic about what you're saying is people don't a lot of times even want to talk about that part of it because they're scared it's going to hurt the discipleship of their people.
Right. When it's the opposite.
It's the opposite. It's like, actually, don't talk about the mission part, but that's because you need to talk about the greater thing, which is their growth, and it'd be like somebody saying, hey man, I actually had this happen to me. I had this literally happen. Okay. Where, there's always a few, you start talking about money. There's people that hit dog a holler. Okay. So people get mad and the guy sits down with me. He's upset, talked about money or whatever, talked about raising money for the church's vision. And he was like pointing to this other church that he knew that is so spiritual that they never talk about money.
Right.
You're right. And they're able to raise money without ever talking about it. And, he was kind of posing that to me, like, why do you feel like you need to talk about it? And it was very simple. It's just like, because I feel like I don't need to try very hard to disciple people with two hands tied behind my back.
Right.
What else do you want me to not do? Should we not sing? Should we not use the Bible? I mean, what else are you going to should I tell people not to evangelize? I never talk about evangelism. Like, what other spiritual component as a pastor that is, there's only a few that are like the big inputs in people's lives that help them grow, We say at Mercy Hill all the time, like, growth in the Christian life is simple. That doesn't mean that it's easy, okay? But something can be simple, and be hard, but it's like, hey, it is simple. It's like, man, there's only a few things that we see in Acts 2. It's like, we're going to gather together, we're going to group together, you're going to hear the word, we're going to give, we're going to be on mission. I'm not, why would we just cut one of those things out? Because we're scared it's going to offend or not, help in their discipleship when it's one of the things that is given for the discipleship of the church.
Yeah, Jesus knows and understands the human heart better than anybody, And you just think about like pastors being afraid to talk about it because, a newer believer is going to get offended or somebody that doesn't go to church is going to get offended. And it's like, yeah, they may actually get offended, but very quickly something spiritual may begin to kind of happen in their life, because we all deal with it in the exact same way. Money gives us the perception of control, the perception of power, the perception of, man, I can control my future, my destiny. Like, you just think about the Bible, how many different cultures the Bible has spoken to, and, the Bible, even New Testament, 2,000 years ago, Jesus knew, like, the human heart back then is no different than today. Like,
right.
Man, people may have it all right on the outside, like everything may look good, but man, the way people view their money and like, man, is God in control or is me having enough money so that I feel like I'm in control? Like, which one is more important? And man, just nothing beelines, like money. And when you get that, when you understand that as a pastor, I feel like it's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like a superpower. And like what you said at the beginning, like it is the thing that can grow the people most. And it's also the thing that can also help the church in terms of like generosity.
Right.
And it's like when you get that, it's just so freeing because you never feel like you're trying to get something from people. Like when you truly believe, no, this is best for them. Like when you really, really deeply believe this is best for them, like it frees you up, I think, to talk about money and generosity in a way that's not weird. Because some pastors talk about it, but everybody can feel that they feel weird about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's like, dude, if if you're the slick salesman, people know that.
Right.
But that's because that's what you are.
Right.
you either are or you ain't. And it's like, if you are the slick salesman that's trying to talk about their discipleship, but really it's about the fact that you just really want the church to have a lot more money so y'all can do whatever, people are going to feel that, But if we talk about money in a way that, like, no, two things are true. Number one, this is about our heart collectively. And God's going to take us to some places that he's not going to take us any other way. Number two, man, when he does that, the overflow is going to be money, and we're going to see ministry go gangbusters. We're going to see adoptions. We're going to see missionaries sent. We're going to see new campuses launched. We're going to plant churches. But it's both of those things. And one of them actually is primary. The discipleship component is primary. I think that one of the ways, Bob, I know that we're trying to strive on this podcast to try to get people to this is one of those matrix moments where people are like, right. If a pastor has ever said out loud, man, I really just don't like to talk about money with our people, or I try not to do that or something. I mean, there's probably something there they need to drill down on. That's like, well, are you thinking about it the right way?
Right.
Because if you really believed it is one of the primary ways that you disciple someone, how would you say out loud, I really struggle to talk about that, So we're trying to get people to understand. One way I think about it is I think about what happens in many dying churches, which is the reverse of what happens in a lot of growing churches. Okay. Growing churches have more energy and more energy and more people than they do money.
Uh-huh.
A lot of legacy dying churches, they have more money than they have energy or people, right? And I think the economy of God's kingdom shines in this reason. Man, when people are put in a desperate situation, what do they talk about? They talk about the need for people to give, right? And what does that do? It sparks more spiritual growth.
Right.
And I think in some of the legacy churches, dying churches, it's like, well, whatever, Aunt Lottie died and left $2 million to the church, and they've got the cemetery taken care of for the next 30 years. And, there's no need for money. I mean, if the pastor stood up on stage and was like, hey, we're raising money for this, one of the deacons would say, well, we already have money. It's like, no, you don't understand that you're trusting in something that now is cutting you off from one of the vital inputs that God uses for spiritual fervency. And that is, man, that we would be pushed to give for his kingdom. You and I'd love for you to share, you and I have seen so much happen when people open their hands to give. Mm-hmm. Yes, ministry happens. Awesome. We're in it for the ministry. We are in it for the numbers. Every number is a person. That's all great.
Right.
But other things happen in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what just about will move you to tears, and that's what I'd love for you to talk about for a minute.
Yeah, so at our church at Mercy Hill, we are towards the back end of a 2-year discipleship initiative that also has a generosity component to it called Deeper. And that whole initiative has been grounded in Psalm 1. And the challenge, and I think this really just goes back to so many of Jesus's teaching, the challenge we gave to people is, hey, not like, hey, we want everybody to give this amount or everybody to give or whatever. The challenge, and we were very sincere about it. The challenge is, would everybody be willing to ask the question, God, are you my deepest desire? And truly wrestle with that question. And because that sort of question, just like, generosity gets right to the heart, that sort of question just kind of, it just puts people in this direct kind of relationship with God to identify, maybe something else that's the deepest desire. Because it's so easy. Well, we talked about this a lot. It's so easy, as God begins to bless you, it's real easy to begin to kind of trust and maybe even have an idol in some of the blessings, kids, marriage, for a pastor, success, growing church. Those things can end up being
right
before God, And so it's awesome. The stuff you wouldn't expect in a financial generosity discipleship initiative, when people begin to ask that sort of question, it's like, man, you have people coming to Christ. I mean, I remember last year we showed a video of a young dude that came to Christ just through the generosity initiative, right. Because we got people to start asking that question. And for him at first, it's like, no, God wasn't the deepest desire, something else was. And it was like a salvation moment for him. You have other people that, there was a story that we've shared of somebody feeling like they got called to the nations to be a missionary through the discipleship initiative. So there's just something real powerful when people begin to ask those sorts of questions. And That's what Jesus was doing with the rich young ruler. That's what Jesus was doing when he talks about money. Like, he's trying to figure out, hey, like, is God the most important thing or is something else the most important thing? And if you just get people to wrestle with that question, you know, like, man, you don't have to tell them to do 100 different things or whatever. It's like, man, if you get people to wrestle with those sort of questions, which if you're talking about generosity in the right way, people will, then it's like, man, you could just be confident. Like, man, my goal as a pastor is to get people to wrestle with this, and then God's going to do all the work of what God's calling them to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think about Augustine, right? It's like, man, there's the big three, money, sex, power. And if that's right, which I think culturally, you just look, you're like, man, that's probably right. Then, you know, when you intentionally set up, you know, teaching and environments to dethrone the idol of money, there's going to be a lot of other spiritual growth that comes from getting that thing off the throne, you know? And so, like, you're right. I mean, we had, you know, I don't know how many times this happened. I'm thinking of one family in particular that we're close to, just from my son and his friend, but like, it was like, man, we're going to give in a big way, in a way we've never given before. Okay, that's awesome. That's great. Think about the ministry that's going to come from that and all that. And oh, by the way, man, I also signed up to go to India for the first time. You know, it's like something about that whole process was, you know, man, money's off the throne. And it's like now the nations are starting to come into view. I couldn't see that because my hands were so full with this other stuff, right? But now I'm starting to I'm hungering for more of what God wants for my life. And I mean, how many people stepped into foster care and adoptions after, you know, we started going through deeper. And I remember one of my daughter's friends gets baptized right after the Deeper Initiative a few months later. And, you know, we do a testimony kind of time or whatever. And in her testimony, she said, I want to put on display that God is my deepest desire. She got that language from the, you know, from the, I mean, you're talking about a 14-year-old, 15-year-old getting that language from a generosity initiative. But it's really because when you start asking the question of deep desire, what's on the throne, man, money is in there. It's in there for all of us.
Right.
You know, I mean, you know, maybe there's somebody that truly is just an ascetic and just that maybe, but generally speaking, for most people, it's up there on the list. And when you begin to, like, you know, talk about idolatry of it, man, other spiritual growth drivers kind of come in.
Why do you think we all kind of miss it so easily, you know? Because, like, even when you think of, like, that verse in the New Testament, you know, where we talk about, like, or Jesus talks about, like, hey, you know, the way we think about Jesus saying it is like, hey, and this is the way we all think, wherever your heart is, like, that's where your money's going to be, right? That's how we all think about this stuff, right? But he says it like the opposite, right?
Yep.
Like, man, where your money is, like, the money is the lead thing. Where the money is, there your heart is going to be. But for some reason, it's like, why do we think about it the opposite way? Pastors do it. The average person in the congregation does it. It's like we don't think that our money can actually lead our heart.
I think it goes back to what we said earlier. I think it's because we only view it as a fruit. Mm-hmm. And so if, you know what I mean? So, like, if money given is a fruit only, then once my heart is already there, invested in the mission, then the money will flow. And what people don't realize is, man, money, you know, giving money is a fruit of maturity, but it is also a discipline that takes you to maturity. It's the idea of running. I mean, you like to run. Mm. It's like, man, who are people that love to run? They're called runners. Did they always love to run? Well, I mean, a lot of times people run and they finally get some breakthrough and then they start to love to run. But there's times when running is a discipline and there's times when running is a delight. And that's the same thing with generosity. There are times when it's a little more fruitish and there's times it's a little more discipline-ish, you know. But I do think it's both, and it's not, you know, we pigeonhole it into one many times. Let me do this. We'll close. Let me give you three quick thoughts. Love to get your you know, reaction. We've kind of talked all the way around this, but let me give just a couple of really poignant sort of one-liners here. You know, I would say question form, okay? Mm-hmm. For people listening to this, you know, do they believe that the primary goal of building a generosity culture is discipling their people, mm-hmm. rather than just, man, their cogs in my wheel of ministry? And that's a tough question, man. Mm-hmm. Like, is that the reason primarily that we talk about money, that we take up an offering, that we try to package vision really well, because they're going to grow, you know?
Yeah. You're asking me?
I'm asking you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you can think of it that way, I think it just kind of solves everything, you know? Because like a lot of pastors, they think they have to put on this like different hat, right? Like, man, I need to be like I need to put it on this fundraising hat, or I need to put on this like, you know, Wall Street broker hat, or like this accountant hat or something, you know? And it's like, no, like, man, if this is just discipleship,
Right.
it's no different than, you know, prayer and being in community and, you know, loving the Bible as God's word. Like, man, money is just in the same bucket of all the other spiritual stuff. And it's probably actually a lead with all that stuff.
Yeah, I remember hearing this a few years ago, and I was trying to make sense of it from a guy that we've learned a lot from, a guy named Ryan Britt. And I said, man, so basically what you're telling me is, in your view of discipleship, generosity is I can't remember what I said. It's one of the first components, or it's a major component or something like that. And I'll never forget, he said, brother, it's the lead foot.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here, is that, man,
And I didn't understand what he meant by
lead foot.
Yeah.
Do you understand now?
I think he's talking about like when you're standing in the batter's box. Is that correct? Like it's your front foot?
I just think he means it's the first step.
But what does he mean by lead foot?
Well, that's the thing. You lead your first step, lead foot. Anyway, okay. All right, second thing I would say is this. You know, why is that true, that it's such a primary part? Okay, I think it's because, and we've said this a bunch of different ways, money is maybe the best indicator of what the heart loves. You know? And, you know, money is such an indicator. Or you can say it like this: when God isn't number one, a lot of times it shows up in our giving, because we'll begin to give towards other things. It can draw our heart away. And so I think for us, like that analogy of the crusader, you know, that would get baptized with everything but his sword before battle, because he knows what he's going to do with it. A lot of believers, that's a little bit how they are with money. It's like, man, I'm going to get baptized here, but I'm going to keep my wallet out. Like, my wallet is not part of this discussion. And I think that talking about money, pushing people to generosity, really has the opportunity to kind of dismantle that hard, entrenched idolatry of the heart when it comes to money.
Yeah, and it's money is like very powerful, you know? I mean, you even think of the Bible, you think of Proverbs talking about like, you know, the person in debt that, you know, they're enslaved to the lender. Like, there is a real power that money can give you. I mean, there's a reason people talk about financial freedom, financial independence,
right.
You know? So it's not that, I mean, money's like extremely powerful, like, and it can do a lot of stuff in your life. And it's one of the reasons it can want to take that place, like you're saying, of God,
Right.
You know, because it's like, man, if I got money, then like, man, you know, if there's a health scare with my kids, like money will take care of it, you know, or putting my kids in the best school district, or, you know, not having to, you know, fear my boss because, you know,
Right.
I have enough financial, like there's some real kind of freedom that comes
Right.
from money, which is why it, I think, competes
Right.
with God so easily.
Yeah, for sure, man. Money can mimic God more than just about any other singular idol I can think of, for sure. So the last thing is, I would say, and then we'll wrap this up, is, man, we teach people to give 10% so that they can learn to steward 100%, right? Like, the idea is not that we want everybody to give 10%. The idea is our entire life, all of our heart, our kids, our houses, all of our money, our possessions, our aspirations, our dreams, the breath in our lungs, it is all in God's service. It's all about stewarding what God has given us. And a very potent way to tie yourself to that type of stewardship is the tithe, is giving the 10%. You know, I remember when we landed here, we kind of would talk a lot about first fruits giving and stuff. And, you know, I know there's a huge debate on that or whatever, but we have moved more into talking about the tithe again. Theologically, yes, because tithe predates the law, right? Like it's something you see before the law. It's something that, you know, I think when I think about Jesus' blood and his work on the cross, I'm like, well, what other kind of imperative that we were given is like dumbed down by the cross. It seems like they're all,
right.
They're all sort of amplified by what God has done for us in Christ. So, for us, we talk about 10%, like, hey, bro, that's the floor. That ain't the ceiling. But we are going to talk about the tithe and the 10% to try to give people a real hook on what we mean. Not tipping God, I put it through a 20 in the plate or whatever, like a country song, but like, man, a true tithe. We want to move people to that. Man, just close our podcast by talking about that, Bob, like how giving the discipline of the 10 can help us teach people about the 100%.
Yeah. I think when people start getting into the debate of, man, is the 10% still relevant today, or is it more or less or whatever, I think you lose the whole point of all of it, which is what you're talking about. Going all the way back to Cain and Abel in the very beginning of the Bible, you have this concept of, by giving God a portion of the first, you are symbolizing that you're giving God all of it.
Yep. And
that's just what it is. Like that's what giving is. That's what tithing is. That's what first fruits is. The way I like to think about it, this illustration a number of months ago just popped in my head. I think it's a good, because back in the beginning of the Bible, it wasn't giving God money. It was giving God whatever, wheat, grain, fruit, like whatever. Like you're giving God, because they weren't exchanging stuff with actual like money the way that we have like currency now, But I think about like when my wife goes to the grocery store and she comes home with like strawberries and blueberries and all that. Everybody wants the first part of the blueberries or the first part of the strawberries, because it's like the first fruits. It's like, it's the best part. You know what I mean? Like you get the blueberries right from the top of the container that they've not been sitting there that long. They're like the freshest. They're not, at the end, 2 or 3 days later, it's like everything is like smashed up in the bottom, and that's what most people want to give God.
Yeah.
Like they want to give God like whatever we got left, God, that's what we'll give you. But it's like, hey, if you got like 10 pieces of fruit or 10 rocks or whatever, the whole idea of first fruits is like, God, I'm going to give you the best looking one, because you've given me all of this. And so by giving the best looking one back to you, it represents that I personally believe that it's all yours in the first place.
Right.
Because that's where we're trying to get people generosity, to believe, hey, it's not a 90-10 thing. Like every single bit of everything that I have is God's.
Right.
And he's given all of it for me to steward it, And it's like, that's where we're trying to get people.
Right.
And whether it's like 10% or 12 or 15, it's like sometimes getting at that percentage is kind of missing it.
Right.
But doing that first, and the whole idea of tithe and first fruits, I think it protects us though. Like I think it really protects us, and our hearts are going to follow that.
Right.
That we're not giving God our leftovers. We're giving him the first and the best.
Good, man. This is great. All right, we'll leave it at that. You guys check out our conference coming up this fall, and the pre-conference is all around this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in building a generosity culture in your church, man, we would really encourage you to check that out.